I'm 87 years old, and I'll tell you something I wish someone had told me when I still had time to learn it the easy way. There comes a point in a man's life when he confuses love with giving, and giving with losing himself. I didn't see it happening, not at first. It felt good, you understand? Felt right. My children would call, and I'd hear something in their voice, worry, pressure, that edge life puts on people when bills stack up faster than hope, and I'd step in. That's what I thought a father does. And right here, I'd lean in a little, lower my voice the way old men do when they're about to say something simple but meant. If this story feels familiar, if somewhere in it you recognize your own life, or maybe your father's, then go ahead and leave a like and subscribe. Not for me, but so these kinds of truths don't get lost in all the noise. Sometimes the quiet lessons are the ones that keep a person standing a little longer. First time was simple. My boy needed help with a business. Just temporary, he said. I didn't hesitate. Then my daughter needed help with her mortgage. Then came tuition gaps, car repairs, little emergencies that always seemed to arrive just in time to need me. And every single time, I told myself the same thing. This is why I worked all those years. This is love. But here's the quiet truth. Love doesn't usually drain you dry. Fear does. And I didn't know it then, but I was afraid. Afraid of becoming unnecessary. Afraid that if I stopped saying yes, I'd slowly fade into the background of their lives. You don't think about that when you're young. But when you've buried friends, when the house gets quieter year by year, being needed starts to feel like proof you're still here. So I kept giving, and little by little, something shifted. Not all at once. No, life doesn't work that way. It happens slow enough that you can ignore it. Calls weren't just calls anymore. They had direction, weight. I could feel it before the words came, and still, I said yes. Then one Tuesday afternoon, funny how the biggest realizations come on ordinary days, I was sitting in a doctor's office. Nothing dramatic, just something that needed fixing. But when they started talking about cost, I did the numbers in my head, really did them, for the first time in years. And I felt it, that quiet drop in your stomach when truth finally catches up. I had given away pieces of my foundation, not recklessly, not foolishly, at least not in intention, but steadily, comfortably, with a smile. And now, sitting there at 84, I realized something that shook me more than any diagnosis could. I wasn't secure anymore, not desperate, not ruined, but vulnerable in a way a man my age should never be. I drove home that day, sat in my kitchen, and asked myself a question I'd been avoiding for years. Have I been buying their love? That's not an easy thing to admit, especially when you love your children more than your own breath. And let me be clear, my children aren't bad people, not one of them. They lived inside a pattern I helped build. I taught them, without saying it out loud, that if they needed something, I would provide it. But I also taught them something else, without meaning to, that I had no limits. And when you don't show limits, people stop looking for them. It took me months to gather the courage, but I sat my daughter down one afternoon. My hands weren't steady, and my voice, well, it wasn't as strong as I wanted it to be. I told her I couldn't keep helping the way I had been, that I should have set boundaries years ago, that my love wasn't changing, but my giving had to. She looked at me, quiet for a long time, and then said something I'll never forget. Dad, I didn't know you were struggling. You never said anything. And she was right. I never did. You see, I had spent a lifetime being the one who handled things. The provider, the steady hand. Somewhere along the line, I decided that having needs made me less of a father, that showing limits meant I had failed. But age has a way of correcting your thinking. Here's what I know now, plain and simple. Your retirement isn't a gift waiting to be handed out. It's not a reward for your children. It's your life support system. It's what stands between you and dependence, between dignity and uncertainty. When you give it away too early, you're not just losing money. You're giving up control over your own life, and control matters more than comfort when you get old. After I stopped being the one who always said yes, things changed. Some of my children adjusted. They understood, even if it took time. And some, well, they called less. Not out of cruelty. I don't believe that. Just, the dynamic had shifted, and without the transactions, they didn't quite know how to stand in the relationship the same way. That hurt. I won't dress it up prettier than it was. But something else happened too. The relationships that remained became real. No preamble, no hidden requests, just conversation, just presence. Smaller, quieter, but honest. And at my age, I'll take honest over comfortable any day. So if you're listening to an old man who's walked this road the long way, hear this. You are allowed to keep what you built. You are allowed to say, I love you, and no. Those two things can live in the same sentence. Your children have time to rebuild, to recover, to try again. You don't. That's not bitterness. That's arithmetic. Now I sit in my home, still mine, thank God, and I have enough. Not more than I need, but enough to choose. Enough to stay where I am. Enough to face whatever comes next without having to ask permission or depend on someone else's schedule or patience. And that's dignity. If I could go back, I wouldn't love them any less, but I would protect myself more. Because in the end, son, freedom isn't something you leave behind for others. It's something you owe yourself while you're still here to live it. You know? After I made that decision, after I stopped being the man who always reached for his wallet before anything else, I thought the hardest part was behind me. I was wrong. The hardest part wasn't saying no, it was living with what came after. Because when you change a pattern that's been there for years, decades even, people don't always know what to do with the new version of you. And truth be told, neither do you. The house got quieter, not all at once. Just a little less ringing of the phone, fewer "Hey Dad" calls that used to come in the middle of the week. At first, I told myself they were busy, and maybe they were. Life pulls at you when you're younger. Jobs, kids, responsibilities stacked one on top of the other like plates you're trying not to drop. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. There's a particular kind of silence that comes when you stop being useful in the way people are used to. Not unloved. No, I wouldn't say that. But not needed in the same way. And let me tell you something honest. At my age, that feeling can sneak up on you. Makes a man question things he thought were settled long ago. I remember one evening, sitting in my living room, same chair I've had for 20 years, worn just right in the places where life has pressed into it. The sun was going down, casting that long, quiet light across the floor, and I caught myself reaching for the phone, not because I needed anything, just because I wanted to hear someone say my name. I didn't call, not out of pride. No, I've outlived most of that. I didn't call because I was learning something new, something I should have learned a long time ago. If a relationship only stands when you're giving something, then what you have isn't steady ground. It's a transaction. And I had built too many of those without realizing it. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not sitting here bitter. Life's too short at 87 to waste what's left on resentment. But I am clearer than I've ever been. Because once the noise settled, once the habit of always stepping in was gone, I started to see what remained. And what remained told the truth. One of my sons started calling again. No reason, no setup, just to talk. At first, it was awkward. You could feel it. Like two men trying to relearn something they hadn't practiced in years. We talked about simple things. Weather, old memories, his kids, nothing urgent. And I realized something sitting there with that phone in my hand. This is what it was supposed to be all along. Not need, not pressure, just connection. It was smaller than what I had before, quieter. But it was real, and real has weight to it. Different kind of weight. I also started noticing something else, something about myself. For years, I had measured my value by what I could provide. That's how I was raised. A man works, a man builds, a man gives. That's his place in the world. But nobody tells you what happens when your hands aren't meant to carry the same load anymore. Nobody teaches you how to be instead of provide. That's a hard lesson. I had to sit with myself in ways I hadn't done since I was a young man. No noise, no role to play, just me, in a quiet house, asking a question I had avoided my whole life. Who am I? If I'm not the one fixing everything. Takes a while to answer that, longer than you'd think, but I found something along the way. I found that I still had a life, even without being needed every minute. I still had mornings, still had my routines. Coffee tasted the same. The air felt the same when I stepped outside. The world didn't close up just because my role changed. And slowly, real slow, I started to build something different. Not a life built on being necessary, a life built on being present. I'd take walks again, nothing far, just down the road, same path I used to take years ago when I had more strength in my legs and less weight on my mind. I'd sit on the porch and watch people pass by, not waiting for anything, just watching. You learn to appreciate small things when you stop chasing big ones. And here's the part I didn't expect. Peace started showing up. Not all at once, not in some grand, dramatic way, just in moments. A quiet morning, a phone call that didn't ask for anything, a meal eaten slowly without thinking about who needed what next. And I realized I hadn't felt that kind of peace in a long time, because when you're always giving, you're always bracing for the next need, always a little tense, always a little on call. And when that stops, your shoulders don't quite know what to do at first, but then they drop, and you breathe differently. Now listen, if there's one thing I'd want you to carry from an old man who learned it the hard way, it's this. Being loved for what you give is a fragile thing. Being loved for who you are, that takes time, honesty, and sometimes the courage to disappoint people. I had to disappoint my own children to finally meet them on equal ground. That's not something I'm proud of, but it's something I understand now. And understanding at my age is worth more than approval. So I sit here, 87 years behind me, not with everything perfect, but with something better than I had before. Clarity. I know where I stand. I know what I can give. And more importantly, I know what I need to keep. Because a man can give away a lot in his lifetime, but if he gives away his foundation, he spends the rest of his days trying to stand on air. And I'll tell you plain, at this age, you don't have time to rebuild from nothing, so you learn to stand firm. Even if your voice shakes a little when you say no. There's one more thing I haven't told you yet, and it might be the hardest part of all. It wasn't the silence. It wasn't the fewer calls. It wasn't even the realization that I had given too much, too soon. It was the moment I saw myself clearly. I was standing in my kitchen one morning, same place I'd stood thousands of times before, coffee in my hand, light coming through the window just like it always had. Nothing special about the day, but something in me had settled enough to be honest. And I asked myself a question that didn't let me look away this time. When did I stop living my own life and start managing everyone else's? Now, that's not something a man likes to admit, especially one who spent his whole life believing responsibility was his greatest strength. But there it was, for years, maybe longer than I'd like to admit. My days weren't really mine. My thoughts weren't mine either. I was always anticipating, always calculating, always thinking ahead to who might need what next. Even when the phone didn't ring, I was ready for it. That's a kind of quiet pressure that wears on you. Not enough to break you outright, but enough to slowly bend the shape of your life. And the truth is, I had accepted it. Worse than that, I had built my identity around it. Being needed made me feel valuable. Being the one who could fix things gave me purpose. So when that role started to fade, I didn't just lose a habit, I lost a version of myself. Now that's a dangerous place for a man my age, because if you don't replace that identity with something real, something steady, You can start shrinking without even noticing it. I've seen it happen. Men who retire and never quite find their footing again. Men who lose their wives and don't know who they are without someone to care for. Men who sit down one day and little by little stop getting back up with the same intention. Not because they're weak, because they never learned how to live without being necessary to someone else. I was closer to that edge than I like to admit. But here's where something changed for me. Not all at once. No big moment. Just a decision. Repeated a few times until it stuck. I started taking responsibility for my own life again. Sounds simple, doesn't it? But it's not. Because it means shifting your focus away from who needs you and toward how you're living. I began with small things. I started keeping track of my own days again. Not in a strict way, just noticing what I did, how I felt, whether I spent the day waiting or actually living it. I fixed things around the house I'd been putting off, not because anyone asked me to, just because they needed doing, and I was still capable. I even picked up old habits I'd forgotten, reading in the evenings, sitting outside without a reason, cooking meals that took a little more time than necessary, and slowly, something returned. Not the old feeling of being needed, something better, a sense that my life still belonged to me. Now listen carefully, because this matters more than anything I've said so far. When you give away your financial independence, you risk losing your choices. But when you give away your sense of self along with it, you risk losing your reason. And reason, that's what keeps a man moving forward when everything else slows down. I had to rebuild that, piece by piece, not for my children, for myself. And here's the strange part. Once I stopped chasing the feeling of being needed, I became easier to be around. There was no pressure in my voice anymore, no silent expectation behind my words. When my children called, and they did from time to time, I wasn't holding on to anything. I wasn't measuring, I was just there. And that changed the tone of everything. One evening, my daughter came by. No request, no problem to solve, just a visit. We sat at the table, same old table, worn at the edges, and talked like we hadn't in years, about nothing important, and yet it meant everything, because for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I had to earn that moment. It wasn't bought, it wasn't traded, it was given freely. And I'll tell you something, from a man who's lived long enough to know the difference, what's given freely carries a different kind of weight. You don't question it. You don't chase it. You just receive it. Now, I won't pretend everything is perfect. Life doesn't wrap itself up that neatly. Not at 87, not at any age. Some relationships never return to what they were. And I had to make peace with that. That's part of growing old too. Understanding that not every story gets repaired the way you'd like, but the ones that remained, the ones that adjusted, that found their footing without money in the middle, those became stronger than anything I had before, because they were built on truth. So if I could sit across from you, look you in the eye, and leave you with something worth carrying, it would be this. Don't wait until you're my age to protect your foundation. Don't confuse generosity with obligation, and don't ever believe that your worth comes from what you can provide. You can love deeply and still set limits. You can care fully and still say no. And if someone only stays when you're giving, then what you had was never as solid as you hoped. At 87, I don't have the luxury of starting over, but I do have enough. Enough to stand on my own. Enough to choose how I live. Enough to keep my dignity intact until the very end. And let me tell you, after everything I've learned, that enough is worth more than all the money I ever gave away. Because it gave me something back I didn't even realize I had lost. Myself.